Yale constitutional law professor Akhil Reed Amar's second book in a trilogy is titled Born Equal, Remaking America's Constitution, 1840 to 1920. In Professor Amar's introduction, he writes, millions of Americans can recite by heart Lincoln's opening line at Gettysburg, but how many of us understand it? This sentence sits at the very center of this book. Akhil Amar was born in 1958 in Ann Arbor, Michigan, was raised in California. After law school at Yale, clerked for Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer, and became a junior professor back at his alma mater at age 26.
Giving Tuesday is coming, a global day to support the causes that matter most. If open access to your government matters to you, you don't have to wait. Make your Giving Tuesday gift to C-SPAN today. We bring you live, unfiltered coverage of Congress, the White House, and the Supreme Court, so you can access your government without spin or commentary. C-SPAN is nonprofit, commercial-free, and receives no government funding. We're powered by viewers like you. Make your Giving Tuesday gift now at cspan.org/donate. And thank you for supporting C-SPAN, your unfiltered view of government.
Akhil Reed Amar, where does the Reed come from?
I'm the first person in my nuclear family to be born in the United States. I was born in the late 1950s in Ann Arbor, Michigan. My parents were doctors from India who came to get medical training and to aid American patients. My dad was a urologist. He's still around. He's about to turn 97. And his boss, he was chief of urology at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, and his boss was Reed Nesbitt. And the day that I'm born, my mom, who's a physician, is going to have to rotate off service in order to take care of the little baby. And residents didn't get paid very much. And Reed Nesbitt, the head of urology at the University of Michigan, gave my dad a raise for this little baby. And we're a very grateful family. I have two kid brothers. We all have Indian-sounding first names and Anglo-sounding middle names. So my brothers are Vikram David Amar and Arun Paul Amar.
Can you remember the first time you had access to the Constitution?
Well, what I can remember is my parents, when I was 10 years old, taking me to Independence Hall, where the Declaration and the Constitution were drafted. It was a medical convention in Philadelphia, taking me to Washington, D.C. We met our congressman. We had lunch with him in the Capitol building. He was a patient of my dad's. My dad's a urologist. Urologists are become good friends with their patients. And if they take good care of their patients, their patients are happy to take care of them. So we had lunch in the Capitol restaurant with our congressperson. We went to Mount Vernon. We went to the National Archives when I saw the actual parchment text of the Constitution and other iconic documents. And wow, that made a big impression on a 10-year-old.
So when did you first read it in full and have to do something with what you were learning?
Maybe not until my sophomore year at Yale College. I went to a public school in California. It never sent anyone to the Ivy League, but I was very lucky to get in. And when I arrived at Yale College on my 18th birthday, coincidentally, it changed my life. It opened me to just a whole new world of books and ideas. I was always a nerd. I always was in the library, but now I have some of the greatest professors in the world teaching classes. And I took a class with a very great professor named Edmund Morgan. He actually co-authored the textbook that I had used as a freshman. And now I'm taking a class with him as a sophomore, and an early assignment was to write about how democratic the Constitution was or wasn't. So I do remember reading the thing start to finish. The paper that I wrote said, oh, it wasn't very democratic. My view now is that it is very democratic and understood historically. So I've changed my mind completely. And that's what happens when you keep reading and you engage other folks. But in Edmund Morgan's class in sophomore year of Yale College, 1977 to 78, I do remember reading the thing from start to finish. I'm not sure I was assigned to do so in high school.
You know, I've read a lot of books about the Constitution over the years. You taught me a lot of things I didn't know. And this is not that big a deal, but I just wanted to ask you about this because you pointed out in your book. And then I discovered there's a third one, but two of the articles that, the amendments that have to do with the 15th and the 19th, you point out same language.
Yes.
Except the switching of one word. And then I found out that the 26th or whatever, the one that on the 18-year-olds the same way.
Yes.
Now, how did that happen? That they use exactly, it's only two sentences.
The Constitution, in my view, is a thing. It's got four corners, and there are many phrases in the Constitution that actually form a pattern. And you won't see this if you're just a justice, even on the Supreme Court, and you're focused on a clause. You'll read the clause in splendid isolation, and you'll miss larger patterns. So you might miss that Article 1 says the legislative power, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested. That's how it begins. And then Article 2, the executive power shall be vested. Article 3, the judicial power shall be vested. And there's slight variations between 1, 2, and 3, and you'll miss them unless you see the pattern. The words right to vote appear 5 times in the document, 3 in the passages you mentioned, 15th, 19th, 26th. Oh, but there are also references in the 14th Amendment, Section 2, and the 24th Amendment. The language of Article 4 talks about interstate privileges and immunities of citizens, and some of those words are echoed in the 14th Amendment, talking about privileges and immunities of citizens that I have against my own home state. I call this intratextualism, looking at one document and seeing the repetition, sometimes with subtle variations of words and phrases in the document itself. Let me just give you one other example. The First Amendment says, Congress shall make no law which shall abridge, blah, 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 blah. So the 14th Amendment says, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge. Shall make no law abridge. They're different because one is regulating Congress and one is regulating the states. Oh, but there's so many interesting patterns, linguistic patterns, if we understand the Constitution. I'm doing this because these are proverbially the four corners of the document. It's one document, even as it's amended over the centuries. But we read it as one thing, and you will miss some of its richness if you just focus in on this clause or that clause and don't see it as a whole.
I've been fortunate to interview a guy named Gordon Wood on several occasions. And the reason I mentioned Gordon Wood is because I found this on the Amazon link for your book. And I just want to read out loud what he said because it's rather strong. He says, wonderful. Born Equal is no simple narrative with one thing happening after another. It is the most extraordinary kind of history that I have read. Akhil has paid tribute to the power of equality in our political and constitutional lives as no other historian ever has. What did that feel like when you saw it?
It was one of the greatest feelings in the world, and it wasn't the first time with Gordon. So let me tell you about the backstory. So I arrive in Yale College on my 18th birthday, and I'm reading a textbook co-authored by Edmund Morgan and Kenneth Stam and Arthur Schlesinger, some of the greatest historians in the world, and some of them are my teachers. And I'm assigned that book as my textbook, and I will take Edmund Morgan the next year, but I'm also assigned books by Bernard Bailyn and Gordon Wood, the two then most eminent living historians of early America, not at Yale, not named Edmund Morgan. And so I become exposed to Gordon Wood, first year of Yale College. Then I reread one of his books in law school. It's the first book he wrote. He's writing it as his dissertation in graduate school, The Creation of the American Republic. And it wins a Bancroft Prize, and it's stunning. And then I end up reading everything else Gordon has ever written. I have all his books. He is my hero. He's about to turn 92, but at this point I've never met him. I've just met him on the page, and books are like that. You can meet your heroes on the page. I really feel in the new book I'm communing with Abraham Lincoln because I'm reading his stuff and I can actually peer into his mind. So Gordon Wood to me is a total hero, role model. When I write books, I actually close my eyes and try to think about what are the favorite books of mine that this one wants to be like. And Gordon has written at least 3 of my favorite books of all time: Creation of the American Republic, a book much later called Empire of Liberty, and one called The Radicalism of the American Revolution. So wow, that Gordon recently would say this nice thing about me. But as I said, there's a little bit more to the story. When I wrote a book in 2005 called America's Constitution, a Biography, it was a Random House book. I walked through the Constitution from start to finish. I'd never met Gordon Wood before, but he reviewed it very generously for the New York Review of Books. And this is like the preeminent spot for book reviews. And he was the preeminent person. Oh, and he said stuff so nice in the paperback edition. They put it not on the back. It wasn't a blurb that I asked him for. They put it on the front of the book. And so it was like I died and gone to heaven, that Gordon Wood thought well of this book because he's my hero. But it gets even better than that, because in the years since then, I've become friends with him. We've co-taught a seminar together for something that's called EverScholar. We're doing it again, he and I, in Philadelphia in honor of the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence in March in Philadelphia. So I've gotten to know him a bit. He's about to turn 92 years old. He's sharp as a tack, and it means a lot to me because, yes, I was trying to write books in the tradition of Ed Morgan and Gordon Wood. They're my heroes. They're not my only heroes, but there's no one greater than them. So the answer is, wow, that felt lovely that he kind of recognized that I was trying to carry forward a project. And the project is to explain to Americans, left, right, and center, what our Constitution is all about, what our history is all about, who we are as an American people, the mistakes we've made, the improvements that we've made, the amends that we've made. So there was no one, not everyone loves the book. I'm sure that just happens. Some people like it, some people don't. I care most of all about what a few people think, truthfully. And there's no one I care whose opinion I value more than Gordon Wood's. So the answer is, wow, that felt lovely, that he actually liked the thing.
In this book, which is your second in a trilogy, which we'll get to in just a second, I need to know about the first book in the trilogy and why. These are big books. The first one was 800 pages. This one's 700 pages. Go back to the beginning of when the publisher decided this is a good idea to do these 3 big books.
Well, the publisher didn't quite decide that. I initially proposed one book to cover all of American constitutional history, a quarter millennium. Basically, it was going to be 1760 to 2000, and 240 years. And as a tip of the hat to Lincoln, it was originally, when the book contract was signed, 12 20-year periods, 240 years. And it was a tip of the hat to Lincoln. And I was going to cover everything constitutional about American history. I'd written a book, America's Constitutional Biography, that walked you, the reader, through the text of the Constitution from start to finish. This was going to try to walk you through the history of the Constitution chronologically. It's again, the idea was one big book about the whole thing. That was the idea. And when I got into it, I realized I couldn't do justice to the granular details. I couldn't really get the reader into the head of Hamilton and Washington and Madison and Jefferson, and also Lincoln, and Frederick Douglass, and also the greats of the 20th century, from Martin Luther King to Justice Hugo Black to Earl Warren. I couldn't fit that into the covers of one volume without being way too superficial. And so I decided, and my publisher kindly let me adjust the contract to do 3 volumes rather than 1. I told you I was a nerd growing up. I love books. I grew up loving many books, but I loved Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. That was a trilogy. So I sort of went from a 1-volume War and Peace Tolstoy-like thing to a 3-volume sort of Tolkien-like thing. And you're right, Brian, the volume 1 is the beginning of the story. And I titled it, so now I have to come up with a different title. 12 score won't work. The Words That Made Us. And the subtitle is America's Constitutional Conversation, 1760 to 1840. And the us is a pun. It's the words that made the U.S. Or in other words, it's the words that made we, the people. And that volume was how these disparate colonies come together. They're founded at different times for different purposes. They're not even talking to each other in newspapers and elsewhere in 1760. They're not retweeting each other. They're not republishing pieces from sister colonies. In 1760, Massachusetts isn't talking to New York, isn't talking to Virginia, isn't talking to South Carolina. They're all talking to London because they're all parts of an empire, but not to each other. And by the end of Volume 1, 1840, we have become we've become Americans, legally and culturally. It's still, there are going to be issues, and that the Civil War is going to be on the horizon. But Volume 1 is how we come together, and we do so, Brian, by talking to each other. America's Constitutional Conversation. I'm such a fan of C-SPAN because you're trying to create a conversation in which all Americans can watch what's happening, and then actually phone in sometimes and talk to a moderator, or sometimes even kind of respond to each other's comments. So I say America becomes American, Volume 1, by talking to each other.
We'll be right back. I'm going to take a little bit of time to read something back to you that you have in your book. And I have to say, this made a big impression on me when I read the book. I had never read this before, and you're going to recognize it immediately. But before I read it, this comes from a man who was a member of the House of Representatives for 6 years. He was the Secretary of War for 7.5 years. He was the Secretary of State for 1 year. He was United States Senator for 5.5 years, and he was Vice President for John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson, total of 7 years. John Calhoun. If you don't mind, I'm just going to take, because I want to read this, then I want you to talk this through. This is Calhoun in your book from a speech, I believe, from 1848. I'm going to read it. We have never dreamt of incorporating into our union any but the Caucasian race, the free white race. To incorporate Mexico would be the very first instance of the kind of incorporating an Indian race. For more than half of the Mexicans are Indians. I protest against such a union as that. Ours, sir, is the government of a white race. The greatest misfortunes of Spanish America are to be traced to the fatal error of placing these colored races on equality with the white race. There's more, but I'm going to let you bring us up to date on how important that particular speech was.
I have a very fraught relationship with John C. Calhoun. I think about him a lot. My hero is Abe Lincoln. Calhoun is really my nemesis on equality and on secession. And this is personal to me. I told you that I arrived at Yale College on my 18th birthday, sight unseen. It makes a big impression on me because I've never been at a place like this before. And Yale has residential facilities, in effect, dorms, but there's much more than dormitories. They have dining halls and social functions and sports teams. 12 back when I was an undergraduate at Yale, residential colleges. At Harvard, they call them houses. And one of them was named Calhoun. And Calhoun was one of Yale's most famous public servants. William Howard Taft, probably even more famous, but Taft was still living when they named the residential colleges. So Yale picked Calhoun to name a residential college from. Much more recently, he got canceled. That residential college is no longer called Calhoun, but Calhoun looms very large at Yale. And I think he was not a good person, but a bad person. And he was a bad constitutionalist as well. So he's openly and avowedly racist, proudly so. There's that. And he actually is not merely making excuses for slavery. He's not an apologist saying, well, we have it. We can't quite get rid of it immediately, maybe in the fullness of time. No, he says it's a good thing. It should be everywhere. The North should actually adopt slavery. He's pro-slavery and pro-white supremacy. And he's ultimately going to be pro-secession. And so he features very prominently in this book as the not Lincoln. And this is very much this book, Volume 2, an ode to Lincoln's vision. States can't secede. And ultimately, we should aim for racial equality. Lincoln grows in that regard. And we should put slavery on a path of ultimate extinction. Now, Calhoun is a tough character. And he, in life, goes at it with another South Carolinian named Andrew Jackson. And our current president, it has been said, bears some similarities to Jackson. Jackson is a tough guy. And Jackson on his deathbed is asked what he's left undone. And he said, I didn't hang John C. Calhoun and I didn't shoot Henry Clay. So don't mess with Jackson. But Calhoun is anti-equality, pro-slavery, and pro-secession ultimately.
You also talk about a guy named James Henry Hammond, another South Carolinian. I'll read this. Slavery does indeed create an aristocracy of talents, of virtue, of generosity, and courage. Domestic slavery produces the highest toned, the purest, best organization of society that has ever existed on the face of the earth. How much of that went on back then, this kind of an attitude toward slavery and toward people who aren't white?
It's especially prominent in the very deep South, especially South Carolina among, above all. 2 or 3 things about this man. One, he's actually Northern born and goes down South. He marries into a very wealthy family. And he's not only proudly slave-ocratic. He says slavery is a good way of life and everyone should have it. He's, in my view, Calhoun was not good. He said, oh, I'm a very good master, but he had his slaves whipped very harshly for running away. That's bad. James Hammond rapes his slaves with abandon. He actually rapes his white nieces. And this comes to light. They're 16 years old and 17 years old, and he's molesting them. And after this all comes to light, South Carolina elects him governor. That was not disqualifying that he molested his own white nieces. So I think actually it was a bad culture. I know there are going to be people watching this who maybe are hating what I'm saying, but facts are facts, and I'm an historian, and I'm going to follow the facts where they lead. So here's my grand story and why they would come to think this. America at the beginning isn't one thing. It's many different things. The Puritans in New England from the beginning think about life very differently than the folks who come from Barbados to South Carolina. The Puritans are seeking to create a city on a hill, a light unto the world, a reformist regime that will inspire everyone, and they're coming from one part of Europe. The South Carolinian whites are coming from Barbados. They want to make money, and they want to make money quickly by enslaving, among others, black-skinned folk. They're coming for different purposes from the beginning. These places have different climates, different coastlines, different cultures. Slavery is really profitable down south because they've got a tropical climate that enables you to make a lot of money quickly on indigo, on rice, eventually on cotton. And they're going to work their slaves to death. Some people, you'll buy them from Africa. A bunch of them will die en route, on transit. And the ones that get here, maybe you'll work them for 2 years and they'll die. But in 2 years, you'll make your money back and more. They don't even learn the English language. You don't interact with them. And when you're making a lot of money, you start to justify this because you don't want to see yourself as a bad person. So you tell yourself all sorts of rationalizing stories. That's the South Carolinians. And they come to say, oh, it's actually a good thing. That's not the Virginians. The Virginians actually think that slavery is bad. They're interacting with slaves in a different way. Theirs is not a rice and indigo culture. It's a tobacco culture. It's gentler, it's kinder, but it's still slavery. And they're hoping eventually to get rid of slavery. George Washington will free slaves at the end of his life. Thomas Jefferson never says slavery is a good thing. He's ashamed by it. He doesn't free his slaves, but he's embarrassed by it. The people in New England, and this is very much at the heart of this new book, from the beginning are getting rid of slavery. Abolition in the world is an American project. Our audience may know about 1619, slavery comes to the New World, but slave ships to Virginia, but slavery existed in Asia among Asians, in Africa among Africans, among Native American peoples, the Aztecs and the rest. Slavery is not a new thing in the world. The new thing, and the idea of freeing individual slaves isn't a new thing in the world. I like movies, so Ben-Hur, Charlton Heston gets his freedom. A funny thing happened on the way to the Forum. Zero Mostel gets his freedom. So freeing, it's in the Old Testament, it's in the New Testament. Freeing slaves is not a new idea. What we call manumission, emancipation. Slavery is not, a new idea in the world. Here's the new idea, and we Americans invented. And I say we Americans, these are not my family members. I told you, my family arrives in the 1950s. But we Americans invent in the world the idea of abolition, ending slavery, not just freeing slaves. And it begins in Philadelphia in 1775, the world's first abolition society. And it's led eventually by people like Benjamin Franklin and Benjamin Rush, who signed the Declaration of Independence. And immediately after the Declaration of Independence, Ben Franklin is going to lead the Pennsylvanians in Independence Hall, the Pennsylvania State House, to adopt a state constitution that begins, all men are born equally free and independent. And immediately that will begin a process of gradual abolition in Pennsylvania. And Ben Franklin is right there next to Thomas Jefferson on July 4th, 1776. Oh, and John Adams is right there too. And in Massachusetts, he's going to preside over a state constitutional convention in 1780. It begins, and it generates a document, a Declaration of Rights that begins, all men are born free and equal. And that will lead to immediately abolition in Massachusetts. And there's going to be abolition in New Hampshire, in Vermont, in Rhode Island, Connecticut, eventually New York, New Jersey. So immediately the North will move toward getting rid of slavery. The Deep South, very defensive, is going to say, oh, it's a good thing and everyone should have it. Virginia is caught betwixt and between, and that will be what becomes the Civil War.
You mentioned Thomas Jefferson, so I'm going to go back to your introduction where you say some things that I want you to explain. You're talking about the writing of the Declaration of Independence, and you say that Lincoln once penned a brilliant campaign letter paying all honor to Jefferson. In fact, the Declaration's proposition that all men are created equal and are endowed with unalienable rights was neither the unique brainchild or the exclusive trademark of the loose-minded, and in 1776, little-known Thomas Jefferson, a lifelong Virginian slaveholder. And I got to keep going. Enormous mischief and confusion in post-1776 history. You say about it's too tightly tying the Declaration to this odd and flawed man and to his home base while slighting other declarationists and other crucial parts of the new nation brought forth in 1776. And I'll also ask you about the Committee of Five, because if you go to the Jefferson Memorial and you look up at the top, there they are, the five. How important were the five, and why don't we pay more tribute to George Mason?
Lots there. You began by asking me about my middle name, Reed. And I said, everyone in my generation has Anglo middle names. My son is Vikram Paul Amar. So I've continued that for the next generation. So if you had asked me at Yale College, I would have said, if I'm ever lucky enough to have a family and to have a son with my wife's approval, I'd want to name my son Jefferson. That's what I would have said in college. And I grew up idolizing him. I've changed my mind on Jefferson. I've soured on him. I'm much more of a Hamilton and Franklin and Washington guy than I am a Jefferson guy. So Jefferson ends up, in effect, claiming credit as the author of the Declaration of Independence. That's what's on the obelisk at Monticello. And John Adams is eating his liver, because in 1776, Adams is far and away the more consequential person. He's a whirling dervish. He's everywhere. He's the Atlas of independence, says another delegate. And he thinks the big move is not July 4th, but July 2nd, when actually America declares its independence in 1776. These united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. They're independent. They're declaring it. And Adams seconds that motion. It's introduced by another Virginian, Richard Henry Lee, but Adams seconds it, and he thinks that's going to be the day, and there are going to be fireworks and celebrations every year in honor of that day, and of me, John Adams, more than anyone, and he deserved it. Well, 2 days later, there's this document giving the reasons why, and there's a 5-person committee that kind of drafts it, and he's on the committee, and so is Franklin, but they give Jefferson the task of actually writing the first draft. And I don't think he had an idea that would become the important document. And I don't think he had an idea that Jefferson would kind of steal the credit for it as the author rather than the draftsman of the first version of it. So yes, what I say is, if you think it's only Jefferson, this all men are created equal, and the text more broadly, you're going to think Virginia, and Virginia never frees its slaves. It sides with the South in the Civil War, and you're going to miss a lot. First of all, Virginia at the time included Kentucky, which doesn't secede later on, West Virginia, which actually bolts from Virginia to stay loyal to the Union, so you're going to miss that. But you're also going to miss that right alongside Jefferson, and far more famous, is the great Ben Franklin, the Einstein of the century, the American Prometheus. He's world renowned, and Jefferson's just a pretty young guy from Virginia that isn't so well known. And John Adams has been crusading because the Revolution breaks out in Massachusetts, Lexington, Concord, Bunker Hill, and so they are older and better known. Franklin, most of all. They're on the committee. There are two others. There's a guy named Sherman from my state of Connecticut, a guy named Livingston from New York. But the big three are really Jefferson, Franklin, and Adams. And once you recognize that, you are going to focus on Franklin and Adams a little bit more and see, they're championing state constitutions that say born free and equal, or born equally free and independent. And that's going to lead to an abolition project in the North that's going to lead to John Quincy Adams, to Charles Francis Adams, to Abraham Lincoln. You're going to be able to trace that line. Lincoln is going to say stuff like, all honor to Jefferson. He's a very clever politician, and he wants to co-opt the other party. It's like Ronald Reagan saying nice things about Franklin Roosevelt, or Bill Clinton saying nice things about Ronald Reagan. It's a very clever, tactical political move, but you're going to focus too much on Jefferson and Virginia if you understand the standard narrative, which is what I thought at age 18. Oh, I want to name my son Jefferson. And you're going to miss the greatness of Franklin and Adams. You're going to miss the importance of the North, the abolition project among Quakers in Pennsylvania and Puritans in Massachusetts. And you mentioned one other person, George Mason. Now, he's in Virginia, and he says all sorts of things that are anti-slavery at the Philadelphia Convention and elsewhere. And he has composed a draft of the Virginia Declaration of Rights in May and June of 1776. And it says, in effect, all men are created equal. And Jefferson is going to build on that because newspapers have already published this in Philadelphia. So he's going to build on this, and he's going to build on Mason. Mason, in turn, is not inventing these things. I show in the endnotes of the introduction that it goes all the way back to John Locke, and it's a theological idea. We're all created in God's image. No one is born a slave. No one is born a slave master. We can't treat each other the way we treat horses and dogs and cats. So that's Locke's idea. And Mason's going to follow it, and Jefferson's going to build on that. But in Virginia, shortly after July 4, 1776, they start tweaking the language of the state constitution because they realize that it has anti-slavery implications, and they're not quite ready to get rid of slavery. So they modify the language. They have the created equal, but then they say, men, when they enter into a state of society, are entitled to certain inalienable rights. And they tell themselves, oh, we white masters have never entered into a state of society with black slaves. We've never entered into that kind of social compact. So when you look at the state constitutions, and this is in the endnotes to the introduction, pay particular attention to the precise wording. A lot of them have this born equal, created equal, equal by nature language. And nature is from the French naître, to be born, or Latin naturalis, naturala, sort of, it's about birth. Okay, so lots of state constitutions have this idea that we're created equal, we're born equal, we're equal by nature, we're naturally equal. But the southern states qualify it with some weasel words, and the northern states don't. And the northern states are abolitionist states. They're getting rid of slavery beginning in 1776. And so when Lincoln comes along, we have a free North in a way that they were all slave colonies in 1775. All of them had slavery pretty much. And where am I getting some of this from? Oh, the great Gordon Wood, his epic book. He wins a Pulitzer for it. The Radicalism of the American Revolution tells a story about how the revolution is accompanied by all sorts of radical ideas about property reform, about education, about abolition, about penal reform. And Jefferson believes these things, actually. He's a great Enlightenment person. He believes in all sorts of reformist projects, but as he ages, alas, he actually gets worse on these things. He starts making excuses for them. He founds a party that has a Southern base to it, and he sticks with the party. So that's why my son is not named Jefferson, because I changed my mind about Jefferson. And the last book was actually dedicated to a bunch of people, including Lin-Manuel Miranda, and Ron Chernow, and Lynn's spouse, Vanessa Nadal, among others, because I have decided I'm more of a Hamiltonian than I am a Jeffersonian.
We'll be right back. So talk about the process of what you do. If we were following you around as you prepare in your lifetime to write these books, what would we see you doing? How much is it sitting in a chair somewhere reading?
Most of it. And I was a nerd as a kid. I spent every day in the summer. I got on my bike. I rode to the local public library. I checked out a book, took it home, read it, and then the next day I got another book and another book. And they were fiction books, and nonfiction books, and they were my world. I had some friends, actually, but books were among my best friends. And then I went to college and I read and read and read and law school. Now I'm supposed to write books as a professor. That's my job. If I have the same chair that Edmund Morgan once had, and I'm not going to be worthy of it if I don't try to write books like Edmund Morgan did. And I can't do that unless I read books all the time. So then I read all of Gordon Wood books, because if I'm going to understand the American Constitution, I'm going to need to know history. Oh, and primary sources as well. So I'm going to need to read Lincoln's speeches and his own notes to himself and all the rest. Oh, and I do one more thing. I'm going to embarrass you, Brian, so I apologize in advance. In the old days, this is 20 years ago, I only watched one television show a week. And I looked forward every Sunday to Booknotes. So I watched Booknotes, and I sat in my chair, and I read books, and I thought, and I read some more books, and I thought, and I read some more books, and I thought. That's my life. Oh, and it would be one other thing. I'm really lucky because I have amazing students in Yale College and at Yale Law School, because I ended up at the same place where I went to school, and they actually, prevent me from leading too solitary existence. I have a spouse. We have 3 kids as well. But the life of a scholar can be, truthfully, a little bit lonely unless actually you understand the books are your friends. I'm making friends with Abraham Lincoln and with Harriet Beecher Stowe, and they're dead, but I can actually interact with them.
What's the first name? You said one of your sons is Paul?
Vikram Paul.
Vikram Paul. And what about the other 2?
Sarah and Kara, anglicized, but they're actually Indian first names. Sarah Josephine and Kara Deborah. So all kind of Indian first names, but that anglicized easily, and very Anglo middle names.
Now, as I said, this is a vast amount of material, and there's just so much in these books. How do you catalog them as you go through, as you read these primary sources, read other books? How do you do that? Where do you put it all?
I used to actually put everything on 3x5 and 4x6 index cards, one fact or citation for each card. I had huge boxes, and then I'd reshuffle the cards and lay them out in a certain way. And that was almost the first draft. The whole thing kind of, now with computers, I just put things in computer files. I try to be very careful. I hope I haven't made mistakes this way. When I'm cutting and pasting someone else's prose, I try to put it in a different font, a different color, so that 2 years later I remember, oh, that wasn't my language, that was someone else's. But I read a lot, and then I begin to think about how to organize a book. And then I read some more, and maybe then I do a first draft. And then at the end, this is the most fun, I go back and reread everything and make sure I've properly cited and given credit. Because sometimes you think it's your idea, and it's not, but you forgot actually that you got that from a paragraph 3 years before. So after I finish the draft, this is the most fun part of the project. I go back often and reread what I'd read and put in all the cites.
How often in your law school classes does a student come in the class who has not read the Constitution?
Most of my students have not read the Constitution start to finish. My first assignment is to read the Constitution and the Articles of Confederation side by side, because I'm an historian. It's building on and breaking with the Articles, and to identify one important similarity or difference between the 2 documents. That's my first assignment. That's what we do for the first week. In this book, America's Constitution, a Biography, Random House, back in 2005, in the introduction, I say most constitutional law professors in colleges and universities and law schools do not assign the document itself. The running joke is that it would only confuse the students.
You worked for Stephen Breyer as a clerk?
I did.
What did you learn about the Constitution working with him?
Well, he wasn't yet on the Supreme Court. He was on a federal circuit court, and we didn't get very many constitutional cases. Most of the cases we got were about federal statutes. What I learned from him most of all is what it means to be a good and great public servant. I picked him because he was a professor before he was a judge. He was a Harvard professor. I was assigned one of his, they're called case books in law school. And I liked the case books. See, I'm a book nerd, okay? So I liked the book. I liked academic types. I thought I might want to be an academic myself. Let me clerk for an academic turned judge. And he was a great role model for me because he was never partisan. He did almost all the work himself. He truthfully didn't need my help very much. So I was just there if needed. But he read all the briefs. He was always open to changing his mind until the very last minute when the opinion had to be released. He thought it was very important to answer the counter arguments and especially to explain as best he could to the losing litigant why that litigant lost. Okay. Now, when you're on the Supreme Court, it's a little bit different because it's not just about doing justice between two parties, but announcing rules for the whole nation. And even though there may be only two parties before you, the issues are ones that affect many, many more people. There are many more amicus briefs and all the rest from interested folk than on the First Circuit, which it met in Boston and was a tiny, slightly a backwater. But I met someone who was a real intellectual, who was totally honest and nonpartisan, who gave his best to everything, who always tried to explain why one party won and one party lost, and who has been a great friend to me in my career and in my life ever since. And I'll say one other thing. He and I have very different views about the Constitution. I fancy myself an originalist, someone who especially emphasizes text and the original history behind it. I think Lincoln was an originalist. Being an originalist doesn't mean being a conservative. It means privileging the text and the history. Stephen Breyer is more of a pragmatist and a precedent follower. So he would focus more on the cases and what makes common sense as opposed to what the words originally meant. They're both honorable traditions, okay, but they're different. But he has helped me in every way, at every turn. When I clerked for him, he was very young, and I wanted to work for a young judge who could be a mentor and advisor over the years. And he's been that in spades.
I've been a little selfish in not asking you the narrative of this book. Figure people, if they really want to know it, they go out and buy it. But I am going to get to a device that you use and ask you why you did this. Abe, Harriet, Frederick, and Elizabeth. And you call them throughout the book by their first name. And I assume some people don't like that you know, and have probably written it up. I haven't seen it, but tell me about that.
You assume correctly. My best friend in the world, perhaps I have 3 or 4 who could lay claim to that. One is a kid brother who also teaches constitutional law, and there are a couple of others. My friend Steve Calabrese, the co-founder of the Federalist Society. I'm a Democrat. I'm left of center, but I try to have friends across the board. But one of my closest friends, Andy Lipka, and I have a podcast together. We just had our 250th episode uploading day before yesterday as we taped this. And we had a special guest, Gordon Wood. Okay. It was our 250th episode, and we talked about 250 years of America, and who better than Gordon Wood as a special guest. So Andy Lipka has read everything I've written over the years and given me comments, and he hates this device, and other people don't love it. Here's why I kept it nonetheless.
Explain, by the way, what it is, because I just gave the first names.
This book is about 4 people in particular. The 4 people who more than anyone else champion a birth equality project. Idea that people are born equal, that you shouldn't be exalted or demeaned in life because of the accidents of your birth, because you're born white rather than black, male rather than female, Jew rather than Gentile, in wedlock or out of wedlock. Hamilton's born out of wedlock, firstborn in the family or fifthborn. I would say born to citizen parents or non-citizen parents. Doesn't matter. You're born an equal citizen. All men are born free and equal. And that's going to become not just born free and equal, born non-slaves, but eventually, if you're born in America under the flag, born an equal American citizen. So that's the big idea of birth equality. For people more than anyone else kind of are my characters who help explain the instantiation of that idea, the encoding of that idea in 4 epic amendments: the 13th Amendment ending slavery, 14th Amendment equal citizenship and birthright, equal birthright, citizenship and fundamental civil rights, citizenship rights, no race discrimination in voting, 15th Amendment, no sex discrimination in voting, 19th Amendment. Doesn't matter if you're born male or female, black or white, you shouldn't be demeaned or exalted. So we don't have people born princes, born kings, born heirs apparent. We're born equal. And I'm trying to write in a novelistic way to make it easier for a reader. So these are analytic constitutional propositions, but I'm trying to introduce you to them by introducing you to the people who made this possible, who gave their lives for this. In volume 1, The Words That Made Us, I talk about, that's about how America comes together, comes to be a we the people, a United States. I have 6 great founders. They're the 6 by acclamation. The first 4 presidents, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, and the 2 geniuses, Franklin and Hamilton. So those are my 6 founders. Now it's this new second book, 1840 to 1920. The big idea is going to be birth equality. I have 4 characters, and it's equality black or white. It's equality male or female. So I have to have a different cast of characters, not just white men. So I have one white man towering above all, Abraham Lincoln. No country's ever produced anyone as great, in my view. But I have a great black man, Frederick Douglass. I have 2 amazing white women, Harriet Beecher Stowe and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And yes, I refer to them by first names, and that is jarring. And not everyone may love it, but here were 3 or 4 reasons why. 1, because I've got women and they're married, their husbands have the same last name that they do, and that can be confusing. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton is married to Henry Brewster Stanton, and he's an important abolitionist, orator, and figure. And so if I just say Stanton, people are going to say, which one? And then if I have to have the whole thing, that's a little bit longer and more. So I'm trying to actually distinguish. If I call her Elizabeth and him Henry, that's equal. Also, even if I called her, Katie Stanton, the Katie, where did that come from? That came from her father and not her mother, and that seemed patriarchal. And I'm trying to talk about women's equality. Everyone has an equal first name, but last names, are a little bit patriarchal. 3rd, I'm talking about slaves. Slaves were called by their first name. Well, if we're going to call him Frederick, then maybe we should call him Abe, okay? To avoid privilege. Maybe we should say, John, for Calhoun or something. So there's that. Also, I'm telling you as an historian, norms are changing. No one ever called George Washington George, okay, in that period. He's, General Washington, Dr. Franklin, Mr. Jefferson. That's the period. But in their lifetime, they all called him Honest Abe. And they called him Abe, but they also called him honest. And he was honest. No one ever said honest Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas wasn't honest, actually. Honest Roger Taney, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, he wasn't honest. Honest James Buchanan. They don't, because James Buchanan wasn't honest. But Lincoln, very famously and humorously, in the speech, refers to these 4 by their first names. He talks about Roger and James and Franklin. That was Franklin Pierce and Stephen. So if they're going to do that with first names, and they're going to be okay being called Abe, and he was absolutely comfortable being called Abe, I thought, if I'm going to offer an intimate portrait of them, if I'm going to introduce you, the reader, to these people, because I do feel I'm introducing you. I feel that they're my friends because I've gotten into their heads and their hearts, and none of them is perfect. But if I'm going to do that, I thought, the reader, I want them to see them as human beings and not just as marble statues. So I thought, and there's still people who are going to hate my choice, and history will decide.
We're running out of time, but there are several other things I want to quickly get from you. All through your book, 3/5 of a person. 3/5 of a person is what a slave was. What impact did that have all through those years when slaves were 3/5 of a person in the Constitution?
You might think that's horrible. They should be 5/5, like everyone else. But as I explained in the book, that would have been worse, because the issue in that clause wasn't how much of a person you really are from God's perspective or even the Constitution's. It's how much extra clout will your state have because you exist. And my view is slave states should never have gotten more seats in the House of Representatives, and therefore also the Electoral College, because they have slaves. So the anti-slavery rule should have been 0/5. A state should never, South Carolina, should never get extra seats because it kidnaps freeborn blacks in Africa, throws them in a slave ship where a quarter of them die and are thrown overboard to the sharks, brings them to America, enslaves them, and then gets extra clout for that. Oh, and then when Hammond rapes them and creates slave children, extra seats in the House and the Electoral College for that. They should never have gotten extra clout for slaves. And if they free slaves, you might say, oh, you're incentivizing this. Then it becomes, instead of 3/5, 5/5. So that's giving them an incentive to free slaves. Well, maybe, but if those free slaves are going to leave and go elsewhere, because South Carolina is not a nice place for blacks or any other slave jurisdiction, 3/5 becomes 0/5 because they leave the jurisdiction. And now we're actually disincentivizing emancipation or abolition, manumission. So 3/5 was bad. And you might say, okay, but what difference did it make? And here's one difference it makes. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, which repeals the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise says no slavery above a certain geographic line. And so slavery will be limited. It won't expand. It's like containing the communists in the 1950s and 1960s. Now where it's about, in the 1850s, containing slavery, containment. So Missouri Compromise says slavery shouldn't expand. It's repealed by Stephen Douglas in the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and the 3/5 clause is the margin of victory. Without that 3/5, actually, that law doesn't pass. Oh, and Lincoln mentions that. He doesn't like that when he gives a speech in Peoria. Without the 3/5 clause, John Adams maybe beats Thomas Jefferson in 1800, 1801. Gary Wills, a very great historian, writes a book called Negro President, calling attention to the fact that Jefferson was deemed by his critics to be the Negro president because he was riding into the executive mansion on the backs of his slaves, because without the extra votes created by 3/5, Virginia would have had fewer electoral votes, and so would South Carolina, and so would North Carolina and the other southern states. Jefferson wins largely in the South. Adams wins largely in the North. And because of the 3/5 clause, Jefferson's electoral vote tally is inflated, and John Adams is not happy with that. John Quincy Adams, his son, is not happy with that. And so the book traces how this 3/5 clause actually ends up creating a regime in which almost all your early presidents and vice presidents are basically Southern slaveholders. Not every single one, but most of them. That includes John C. Calhoun, who, as you mentioned, was a vice president under 2 different presidents. 8 of the first 9 presidential elections are won by a plantation-owning, slave-holding Virginian. 3/5 gives the South a big leg up, not just in the House, but in the Electoral College.
As we get to the end of our discussion, a couple of things. If people want to listen to your podcast, where do they find it? What is it called?
If you forget, just Google Akhil Amar podcast, but it has a punning name, America's, not America, America's Constitution. I do it with my dear friend, Andy Lipka. He's not a law professor. He's not a lawyer. He's a retired ophthalmologist. The person in the world whom he's most like is you. He's a citizen who's interested in everything. He reads very broadly. He stands in for the audience the same way you do. Just saying, okay, Akhil, you said this, but what about that? Or here's a Supreme Court case. What do we think about it? Here's a presidential executive order. What should be our reaction? Sometimes we have guests. This week, Gordon, what do we have? Academics. We have politicians. Gary Hart has been on the show several times. We have journalists, the great Bob Woodward. We have many academics, we have Stephen Breyer on judges and hopefully and former justices. We bring people on the right. We bring people on the left. Our model is not so different from C-SPAN. We're just trying to provide public education to our fellow citizens. And my podcast partner, to repeat, is Dr. Andy Lipka. He's a retired ophthalmologist.
When did your parents come from India and how old were they?
In their early 20s. They came quite independently. My dad first arrived in about 54, 55, right as Brown versus Board of Education is being decided. And my mom, who doesn't know my dad at that point, comes independently. And they meet basically in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And that's where I'm born, at the University of Michigan. We quickly move to California, where I grew up in California public schools.
What did they think as they watched you when you were 18 off to Yale and getting firmly involved in the Constitution and basically defending this country's way of managing itself? What was their reaction to that based on what they had grown up with?
Well, they're very self-sacrificing parents. Everything that I've ever had in life was because of them. They paid for everything. My mom passed a couple of years, 3 years ago. My dad is about to turn 97. And I think they did not force me into medicine or into science. They said, you get to decide. They gave me an Anglo middle name so I could decide how Indian I wanted to be or American I wanted to be. They wanted me to choose. They came here because they thought this was a great country. And I have 24 first cousins. And the ones who weren't lucky enough to be born in America, many of them wanted to come here, and my parents sponsored them. And they've been great contributors to American society, doctors, engineers. They've saved a lot of lives and done a lot of good things. I'm proud of my family members. And my parents were the first to be here, and we brought others over. My cousins who are born here, they don't want to leave. So I believe in American greatness, because that's been my family story. And when I grew up, I would often think, why am I so darn lucky? I'm born here. My cousins aren't born here. Why is my life so much better? And I began to think, maybe it's because of the Constitution. Maybe it's because something about the American system. I want to spend my life paying that back. On the day I am born, Brian, in Ann Arbor, Michigan, this country, its people, the Constitution, make me a birthright 14th Amendment citizen, even though my parents are not citizens the day I'm born. They later became citizens. They were here legally, but it actually doesn't matter. I'm born equal as an American. My kid brother is a neurosurgeon, one of the world's great neurosurgeons. My middle brother is a law professor, very distinguished law professor, law dean, first South Asian, a prominent South Asian dean at a great law school, University of Illinois College of Law. He's now back in California. He was the first South Asian to clerk on the Supreme Court for Justice Harry Blackmun. So our family is deeply patriotic, very grateful to be in the United States. Do not take that for granted. And I hope that in our own way, we're trying to repay this great country by reminding our fellow citizens of its greatness. And its greatness, of course, includes the Declaration of Independence and all men are created equal, and the Constitution, and all of the amendments, the Lincolnian birth equality amendments that make this a very special place in the world.
By the way, I just need to tag this on. The producer of this podcast for years is a man named Akhil Reed, born in Chicago, is an Indian American, and he had nothing to do with our selection on this because of that. But he's been a great producer, and I wanted to recognize him. The name of this book is Born Equal. When, based on your pace, will the third in the trilogy come out?
Probably will take me at least 2 or 3 years, maybe more. I admire Robert K. Rowe, but I hope it doesn't. He's writing a great, multi-volume history of Lyndon Johnson. The tentative title of Volume 3 is Lincolnian, Earth's Best Hope, because I believe this country is to borrow from Lincoln, the last best hope of Earth. And it will take the story from 1920 to the present moment. It will have many more characters, shorter chapters because time is speeding up, many more people, but it will especially be about what happens when America increasingly engages the world, where the world becomes more democratic in the American model, and America becomes more global as people from all around the world increasingly come to America, in part because of immigration reforms and other things. How we, in the last 100 years, are maybe unique in the world in being a place where the great-grandchildren of all the other countries and continents come together. It's a harder project. It's a more challenging project because we don't have race, national origin, religion, first language in common. So it's a more challenging democratic project than a country that's monocultural, maybe a Norway or a Germany or a France. But what we have in common, Brian, is our Constitution and the Declaration and the story behind it. That's what makes us America. So I need to finish the third volume so that actually we have the story from 1760 to the present moment. So wish me luck.
I do. The name of this book is, again, Born Equal, and our guest is Yale law professor Akhil Reed Amar. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you for everything that you do.
Thanks for tuning into this week's Booknotes Plus podcast. If you have a moment, please consider rating and reviewing us wherever you listen to podcasts. Your feedback will help others discover the program. And don't forget to share this episode with friends and family. For the latest on new episodes, schedule updates, and more, follow us on X @C-SPAN Radio.